Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel, and today's video is called A Window into the Future. Now, today's video is in collaboration with a smaller, but not much smaller, because I'm not a very big channel myself, YouTuber called DylanEDU. He does similar Canadian political content, more focused on shorter, more bite-sized segments instead of in-depth political analysis that I do. But today we are doing a collaboration looking at the potential futures of where the NDP and the Liberals might go. And I have two such scenarios broken out. He covers the rest of this. He covers 5 scenarios in his video. I'm covering 2 of these in more depth like I normally do in all my videos. If you want to check out the rest of it, go check it out on his channel. And just before we begin, I would once again like to shout out my channel members. I greatly appreciate you guys for supporting the channel, and if anyone else wants to support my channel and really help me be able to afford to do more things and do more in-depth things, I have a bunch of things down the pipeline which I want to do, but I obviously need the funding first. By all means, join below to support the channel. If you cannot afford to give a monthly donation to me, I perfectly understand that, perfectly reasonable, especially in this given economy. And in which case, all I ask of you is to do the regular, generic YouTube things. Like, share, subscribe, comment below. It seems so small, but it extremely helps. Every single like and every comment I read. I don't really read the likes, it doesn't make any sense, but it's all appreciated. But let's get on to the main video. So let's just wrap up. Where are we right now? So I don't have another full update yet, mostly because I want to wait to get more polls in, because I am a little uncertain on some things. But we'll save that for another full video. Probably next month. But as it stands, this is 338 Canada's model and his current projection. And the Conservatives are strongly ahead. He's projecting about 179 seats. And if we go over to myself, I have a mini update here. We look at the September 25th mini update here. I have it at 118 to 168. But it's trending upwards in general. Right now, we're just seeing a slight minor regression in Ontario, causing the difference, because the week before I had it at 170 for the Conservatives. And keep in mind, in general, my model is more sluggish than 338s, and that's on purpose. But we're not going to get much more into the details on that. If you care, comment below, and I might do a more depth video at some point. But at this stage, barring something dramatic happening, the economy being resuscitated and going amazing, or any such similar event, it looks very, very, very likely we will see a Conservative majority government. And if this happens, let's say in 2025, we will have 4 years of Conservative government in going into 2029 election. And that leads to an interesting question. What happens in 2029? What happens in between that? Because we see all sorts of things happening in provincial level. So if you look at Ontario, or you look at my own home, Nova Scotia, where the Liberals and the NDP are very divided and very split. So the Conservatives are kind of winning by default in both provinces, if we even want to call the provincial parties Conservatives, especially in the case of Doug Ford. But the point stands. In these provinces, the progressive Conservative parties are basically winning by default. Will that happen federally? Maybe, but that's not a very interesting thing to consider. So we really have 2 things to consider here. We have the much bemused and talked about party merger, and then we have the more simple, more mundane NDP. The NDP eventually recovers. And we're not discussing what happens if the or if the Liberals rebound. And the reason why I'm not going to discuss that today is not that it's entirely implausible, though I think it is seemingly unlikely right now. But I'm not going to touch on that. Because we know what a Liberal win looks like. We saw 2021, we saw 2019, we saw 2015. We know what that looks like graphically, geographically, and roughly demographically. Because it happened. We've seen them. They exist. In fact, if you look over the last 90 years, about 2/3 of elections have been this way. So there's nothing interesting about that. There's nothing to be gained. There's nothing to be learned. But these other two scenarios, there is something to be learned and there is something to be seen. So let's go over to the first one. So let's leave 338 here. We don't need him anymore. And we'll look at scenario 1. The NDP gain ground and pull a win. Now, this doesn't necessarily need to be 2029. It could be 2033. I think at this stage, again, 1 year is an eternity in politics. 8 years is an eon. So anything could happen in 2029. And I have no desire to even pretend I know what's going on there. But let's assume, for the sake of this video, that by the time the quality of government, which seems to be going to majority in 2025, is at risk of losing, the NDP is now in a position to challenge him. Will that be under Jagmeet Singh? I don't think so, personally. I think there's a very good likelihood he's going to lose his own seat in the next election, in which case he's probably going to resign as a result. But for the sake of argument, we're going to leave him here. It could really be anyone you want to be the next NDP leader. We could pick like a Rachel Notley. We could pick a David Eby. We could pick Charlie Angus or whoever you want. But it's going to be somebody. Now, you might ask yourself, okay, so why does the NDP suddenly do well? They're doing terrible right now, understand. Now, the easy answer to that is the NDP, either because Singh himself realizes this or they replace Singh and get a different leader, looks at their Western provincial parties and then looks at their Eastern provincial parties and then realizes the Eastern provincial parties are an utter, abject, complete failure and the Western ones are really effective. The NDP's currently set to win re-election in 2024 in BC. They're set to win the Manitoban election right now, which, well, we'll get a full Manitoba update sometime. I'm just waiting on a few more polls post-debate, but eventually we'll have an update on that. And in Alberta, 2023, they were pretty close. And in Saskatchewan, sure, Mo is pretty strong right now, but the Saskatchewan NDP are a serious party that can win and has historically won. You look in Ontario, the NDP governed once. My home, Nova Scotia, once. I don't think they've ever governed in Newfoundland, PEI, or New Brunswick. They don't even exist in Quebec. So out east, they're utter failures. Out west, they succeed. Well, why is that? If Eastern Canada is usually considered the more left-wing part of Canada, and Western Canada is the more right-wing part of Canada, why are the Eastern NDPs so much less effective than the Western ones? Well, an interesting twist of fate, it probably is because Eastern Canada is more left-wing, on average. That the parties, the NDP in the East, is less effective. Because the electorate is slightly more left-wing on economics, it means the fringe of the electorate, the core base of the NDP, you might say, is even more left-wing. But these days, in 2023, when a base gets more left-wing in the Anglosphere, this is not true in every country, but in Anglo countries, when a party gets more left-wing, they usually don't move left on economics. They move left on social issues. You look at the 2022 Ontario election, and Andrea Horwath's NDP basically only campaigned on left-wing social issues. They mostly didn't touch economics in any meaningful fashion. They weren't meaningfully distinct from Doug Ford's kind of bog-standard centrist economic platform. They didn't meaningfully distinguish themselves there. It was entirely social issues. You look out west with David Eby or Rachel Notley or lesser extent Wab Kinew. They don't distinguish themselves from their conservative opposition on social issues. Now, don't get me wrong, when the NDP are in power in the West, they do left-wing social things. That's how this always works. That's how that's always going to work. That's what it is. But they campaign more on economic issues and less on social issues. Likely because the electorate out west is more inherently conservative. So campaigning on social issues to win leadership of these parties, not even to win the election, but to win the leadership, is so much harder. You can't be as overtly left-wing. And they have a political apparatus in these parties that prevent and choke out strands of the party that are too overtly left-wing, or at least historically have been doing this. We'll see after Notley's successor is picked if that continues. So what the federal NDP could do is look at the Western parties and adopt a very similar playbook. Basically eschew the Eastern parties and their abject utter failure, the near extinction of the NDP in New Brunswick and PEI, the abject failure of the NDP in Nova Scotia, who were barely competitive outside of Halifax, only 40% of the province, and they're only barely competitive in Halifax. They don't even sweep Halifax, unlike the Western parties, which sweep most of Vancouver or most of Edmonton. Nova Scotia NDP don't even win all of Halifax. They win maybe 20% of Halifax, which is, sorry, I rephrase this. They win maybe 50% of Halifax, but Halifax is only 40% of the province, so they only win about 20% of the province. Just an utter failure with no hope of going anywhere because it's too left-wing socially. Rural Nova Scotia doesn't want to vote for them. Same thing in Ontario. The Ontario NDP is too left-wing to win outside of strong union areas, which they're losing support in, for the record, or core extremely liberal downtowns such as in Ottawa or Toronto. But if the NDP were to do a more Western approach, kind of what Jack Layton was doing before he died of cancer, this would be the blueprint for them to succeed going forward. And this would be the perfect time post-2025, post what seems to be either a majority or possibly a once-in-a-generation landslide for the Conservatives, depending on what the polls hold up. They would have a chance to do this rebrand. And if they do this rebrand and they successfully pull it off, this is a scenario we could realistically see. And what does this scenario tell us? What is their coalition? What is their base? Well, if you look at these maps and then you cross-reference them with the provincial parties in Western Canada, you'll notice that these basically line up perfectly with how the provincial parties for the NDP work. In Saskatchewan, they dominate Saskatoon, they do strong in Regina, and they're a little competitive in the rurals, but not that competitive, which is why right now the Saskatchewan party is so dominant, because Saskatchewan's very rural. But at least the Saskatchewan NDP dominate the urbans, unlike the Nova Scotia NDP. In Winnipeg, in Manitoba, strong performance in Winnipeg, winning the north, more native areas. That's exactly what the provincial party is probably going to do this election. You look at this map for BC and you cross-reference it with the map for provincial party. It's very close. There's some green in reality, but there's no green here. And in Alberta, again, same story. Edmonton is controlled by the NDP. There's some competitiveness in Calgary, but Calgary's conservative advantage. Though, again, you could see Central Calgary go NDP in a particularly close election, like we just saw. So, in Western Canada, a result like this shouldn't surprise you. Everything west of Ontario here is a perfectly plausible and realistic scenario for the NDP if they adopt the provincial party model and do it federally. Then we could go east of Manitoba and we extrapolate those trends. What we should expect them to do is dominate Essex, dominate London, dominate Hamilton, dominate Northern Ontario, dominate Niagara for the most part. We should expect all of that. That's what the provincial party already does, and a more Western-style NDP should do that even easier. Oshawa, Ajax area, a very strong manufacturing part of the GTA, dominated by the NDP again. That makes sense. Core downtown Toronto, yeah, they're going to win that. That makes sense. This should seem logical. And then some areas where they start struggling, Oakville, Burlington, York, Etobicoke, Mississauga, and they're still doing fine here, but they're doing worse than the Liberals are. That also makes sense. These are wealthier, less working class, less unionized areas. These are demographics the NDP does really bad in. The demographics of the NDP, when they perform their best and they're being the most legitimate to their core purpose, is working class, unionized, and to a certain extent, poor. Those are the demographics the NDP does best with. You can throw in various racial things too. They tend to do better with natives, so I'm not sure if that's because the NDP are inherently better with Indigenous groups, or if that's just really a failure of the other parties. I don't really know. I couldn't really tell you. You would probably need to talk to a native person to consult with them on that. Out east here, with not knowing many on a first name basis, I wouldn't want to prognosticate what would happen or why that is. But again, in Ontario, this kind of makes sense. This is sort of tracking historically where the provincial party did well and where you would expect them to do well federally. Because the other thing, the NDP historically has done quite well with immigrant groups. That's why the Scarboroughs and the Bramptons make sense to be so strongly NDP. But if we see an NDP like current Jagmeet Singh and his current very socially liberal platform, if that was tried, we should expect places like Bramptons, places like Surrey, places like Scarborough to be a disaster. Richmond, Richmond, BC as well. Because these strong immigrant communities are not socially liberal. They might be fiscally left-wing, which is what the left often mistakes about, and why a fiscally left-wing but socially moderate NDP, such as the one under Jack Layton, such as Rachel Notley, such as David Eby, a party like that for the NDP can be successful nationally. Because it's already successful in all of the Anglo provinces that have tried this model. We're seeing it right now in Manitoba. Wab Kinew is running center-left on economics and centrist on social policy. Now, in reality, this is how this always works. The right does this too, and they should do this too. When they get in power, they do left-wing social policy, and the right would do right-wing social policy. That's just how that works. but their messaging and their focus is on economics. That's how this be. Moving on further east in Quebec, we see the Bloc comfortably resurgent. They do strong in most of, or basically wipe out the left, or say the Liberal NDP, in most rural ridings. The Conservatives get a little weaker in places like Chicoumte, Lafjord. The names, they kill me. And in Montreal itself, it's a bit hard to see in the graphic. I guess I could zoom in. Oh, look at that. We can zoom in. Some of these ridings in Montreal are pretty close. A lot of them are, there's 4 within 5 points, and 2 that are within 2 points. Now, some of these are close, such as this one right here. I can't think of the name of this riding. That's close because the Liberals are in second place. But some of these are because the Bloc are in second place. And that's actually really the thing we should get from this map. The flip side of the Liberals' incredible vote efficiency, around 30 to 35%, is that they drop to about 18%, and the NDP does well enough, the Liberals get wiped out. Because the NDP can narrowly win all of these Liberal seats. If we drop the NDP vote share by 4 points, first off, we'd have a Conservative minority or majority government, depending on the exact circumstances. The NDP vote is less efficient than the Conservative vote. It's much, much, much more concentrated. They have much, much, much more toss-ups than the Conservatives do. But the Liberals, in turn, will gain some seats if you reduce NDP vote share. If you just switch it from 37 to 17 to 35 to 20, then you start seeing some of these Mississauga ridings, some of these Montreal ridings, maybe some of these BC ridings, some of these Winnipeg ridings, etc., go red again. Just how it be. And then finally, here, out east, most east, Atlantic east, again, we see the same phenomenon. Urban, more working class areas, such as St. John's, they go NDP. Labrador, very high degree of Indigenous population, goes NDP. Halifax, urban, high immigration rate, goes NDP. King's Hants, probably an outlier. I don't really believe that. But math is math. Sydney and Victoria, again, very urbanized, very unionized, very working class. And then in the Acadian ridings of Moncton, Beausejour, and Acadie-Bathurst, that's very likely just linguistic politics playing at hand. Acadie-Bathurst and Beausejour are 2 ridings that the Liberals are only barely losing in right now. The rest of Atlantic Canada, again, it should make sense. Rural, mostly white areas are voting Conservative. Now, again, if we look at some of the more recent polls, and we see someone like Singh run this NDP in this hypothetical 2033 election, that immigration status is no longer an asset to the NDP, because Singh is alienating a lot of these immigrant communities with his social policies. They are actually supporting of him on fiscal policies, because an important distinction, and it's far too complex to get into this video, but Anglophones are probably the most consistently fiscally conservative demographic in the world. The reason why in Canada right now, mostly white is a useful proxy for people who are sympathetic to conservatism is that historical conservative parties in Canada have mostly focused on fiscal conservatism. And Most Anglophones are white in Canada, almost all of them. And to be clear, Anglophones need to have English as their native tongue. Otherwise, you're not an Anglophone. Your native tongue dramatically affects your political alignments. It's far, far too complicated to get into this here. Comment below if you want me to talk about that maybe one day. But Anglophones are the most fiscally conservative demographic basically anywhere in the world. So it makes sense that predominantly Anglophone areas, when your choice is a very fiscally liberal party or moderately fiscally conservative party, will break fiscally conservative. If the NDP are running as mostly a socially liberal party, we should expect almost the opposite. Because Anglophones are also tend to be more socially liberal than other cultures, other ethnicities. Now, that's more of a history and tradition thing than a more innate characteristic. English culture has a very long history of liberalism. It is the birthplace of liberalism to begin with. So we should expect this demographic to be more historically liberal on social issues. But we should expect them to be more fiscally conservative on economic issues. And that's where the NDP can succeed, is if they understand this dichotomy. Singh doesn't, and that's why he fails. But let us just do a quick look at math here. That's not what I want to do. We want to use this one. Sorry about that. We'll just close that for now. Okay. I don't know why there's this screen artifact right here, but apologies. So we see here basically the same picture. We have decent performances in Saskatchewan and Alberta, strong in BC, Manitoba, decent again in Ontario and Nova Scotia, but then pretty mediocre everywhere else. Again, we should expect this. This makes sense. Overall, the NDP vote isn't very efficient. If, again, just a 4-point swing to the Conservatives, or it's not a 4-point swing, a 2-point swing to approximately a tie, about 35.7 to 34.8, the Conservatives win. In this NDP Conservative two-party system, we should expect the Conservatives to be the natural governing party. Their vote is just inherently and intrinsically more efficient based on the demographics they appeal to, especially if the NDP doesn't resist the urge to go all social liberal like Anglophone left-wingers want to do. That's why the Democrats, that's why or not UK Labour, but New Zealand Labour, that's why the Liberals are so surprisingly socially liberal, so stubbornly socially liberal compared to any European political party. Because Anglophones, for various reasons, are more socially liberal than anyone else. But let us go on to this scenario. A combined NDP Liberal Party. We're going to call it the Liberal Democratic Party. Now, this one is interesting. So, obviously, combining the two parties is not going to get you the sum of the votes for two parties. That's not how it works. That's not how it worked with Reform and PCs. It's never going to work that way. The Liberals and the NDP will lose voters to the Conservatives, to Bloc, to Green, to PPC, if they merge. That is intrinsically going to happen. And I had to do a very concocted scenario here to make this. Because the way they lose their votes, if we look at the Canadian Election Survey from 2021, that Brian Burgett on Twitter has broken down ages ago now, but the data is the data. It doesn't matter when he did it. We should expect 17% of Liberals and 13% of NDP voters to become Conservatives if the parties merge. Now, in this scenario, I did not assume that. I assumed only half of those numbers, 8.5 liberals, 6.5 NDP. The reason why I scaled back that assumption, I also scaled back the same thing for the bloc, and the ND or the Greens, the PPC, etc., is if you don't do that, it's almost impossible for the Liberal Democrats to win. If they lose that many voters, they would need to be utterly destroying the Conservatives without the merger to win. With my new assumption, the NDP and the Liberals collectively maintain 75 and 83% of their existing electorates, and the rest is splintered among every remaining party, with the Conservatives getting about half. That's the only way this works. Otherwise, it doesn't. And before we get into talking about overall data, overall trends, I will just bring out the raw data here. We don't need these. I can just remove those. Live spreadsheets. This is what we watch, right? Anyways. So this here is the base scenario I need to create in order for a Liberal NDP merge to make sense. This barely makes sense. I think it might happen, but it barely makes sense. We see here these three parties, and the Greens aren't merged here, just to be clear, but a Green NDP Liberal coalition only has 164 seats. That's not a majority. Now, here there's 169 seats, but give me the benefit of give me some slack here. It was really annoying to try to make this finagle here, because what's the word for it? To tweak the parameters such that we don't have a liberal, a working left-wing majority without a merger into one with a merger was really finicky, and this was the closest I got. So just imagine they win one toss-up seat, okay? Can you do that for me? Thanks. Like, imagine they win Oshawa here. There you go. That's how close this needs to be, because if we look at this 34.6 turns into 38.6. The Conservatives gain 4 points from this merger. The People's Party gains half a point. Other gains half a point. The Bloc gains nearly 2.5. These are the things this merger does. This is why this merger hasn't happened yet. The NDP and the Liberals aren't the same party. They have different bases. The NDP has blue-collar, unionized working class people in their party who are socially conservative and fiscally liberal. The Liberal Party has big business, fiscally conservative, socially liberal people in the party. They will lose some of both demographics if they merge, because the Liberals don't have the brand credibility, the brand reputation, and the trust that the NDP does on union issues. The NDP doesn't have the brand trust, the brand recognition, all etc., on business, pro-business issues. And in fact, pro-business and pro-worker are usually in contrast, because the desires of unions and the desires of business are usually opposed. Not always, but usually. So we should expect them to lose voters, just like in 2004, the Conservative Party got fewer votes than Reform and the PCs did together. Now, since then, this has recovered. They're not getting more votes, or in the same ballpark as the unmerged parties, but that's not a guarantee. And in the case of the left, I think we should genuinely not expect this. Because, for lack of a better term, conservatives are used to having more political disagreement than the left is. It's natural in conservative space to have pro-business, pro-labor, social conservatives, social liberals, any other flavor in between in the same tent debating with each other. That's not normal on the left. Will it always be that way? I don't know, but for now it's not. But let's just quickly walk over this data. None of this should surprise you. So, out Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, PEI, the left has solid leads. Makes sense. New Brunswick's pretty tight. Again, makes sense. Quebec, the bloc just explodes and becomes extremely dominant. In this case, they technically hold balance of power, but remember, we are using Oshawa as a liberal swing. Or it has one liberal. It was just too much work to try to make that work perfectly, so I didn't do it. Again, Ontario, there's a comfortable lead for the combined parties. And this is where a lot of the success comes in because they dominate Ontario. And then out west, it's a lot closer with only a slight lead in BC and a slight loss in Manitoba. So what is the demographic of the combined Liberal Democrat Party? Well, again, citing the work Brian Burgett did in his Canadian election study. Data, it's not his study, but he brought the data from it into the analysis on the data. Roughly 45% of the country, plus or minus a bit, are socially liberal, fiscally liberal voters. And then the other 55% is everything else. Now, a lot of those everything else voters go Bloc. The Bloc is a very specific party that will not and could not exist without nationalism. It's especially not getting 44% range without nationalism being the driving factor. Similar story with the CAQ provincially. The CAQ would not exist if nationalism wasn't a big voting issue in Quebec, despite whatever pundits might want to say. It's a really big deal there. But if you remove Quebec and you just look at the Anglo parts of the country, what we get is kind of a supercharged scenario of the current Liberals. They're just a little more efficient. Or efficient's not the right word. They're a little more oppressive in certain areas. Notably is Ontario. London, Windsor, Hamilton, the GTA in general. The LDP will utterly dominate these areas. Why? Well, a lot of the pro-union sentiment of the NDP still carries over because a lot of union people are very fiscally liberal. They will still vote for this merged party, even if they might be slightly more socially conservative than the rest of the base. Because that's what it is. A lot of them will still vote this way, so they carry these voters. And they will utterly dominate the urbans. This particular configuration of Canadian politics is actually the closest we will have to a U.S. political sphere, a U.S. political system. Because the U.S. political system, much to the misunderstanding of basically every Canadian political commentator I see, and actually a lot of American ones, the U.S. political spectrum and political sphere is basically big cities versus everyone else, with small sections of historic unionized areas bridging the gap. And the Democrats in the US win basically when they can convince unionized workers to vote. They don't win Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, because those areas are intrinsically Democrat. They win those states because they can convince unionized workers to vote in those states. Those unionized workers are probably never going to vote Republican. Some will, sure. Most won't. It's either Democrat or nothing. Because the union issue is so controlled by the Democrats. That will be the same story in Canada. If we see this political sphere, this distribution, what we should expect is the entire election, even more than today, the entire election will be Kitchener, Northern Ontario, coastal BC, and then a few ridings here or there, like Niagara, some of Atlantic Canada, etc. That's going to be the whole election. Those are the main areas being moved. Yeah, you'll see movement in the GTA. If the Conservatives are to win, they should win like most of York, for example, or North York, or whatever the part's called. We should expect that, sure, yeah. They're going to win. They're going to do well in Winnipeg. Sure, cool. Though, again, the winning in Winnipeg is going to be places like Elmswood, Transcona, going Conservative. And in this scenario, like the NDP scenario, we should expect the Conservatives to win more often. Their vote is more efficient. It's not a surprise, and it's not a secret that I needed to give the Liberals a 3-point lead here. If I construed this to be a popular vote tie, the Conservatives would win. Just like in a popular vote tie in the US, the Conservatives win. In Anglo countries, in general terms, there are more fiscally left-wing voters. I phrase this wrong. There's more socially left-wing voters than there are socially right-wing voters. All the economic voters on the left are already likely voting. I phrase this wrong again. Apologies. All of these socially motivated voters who are going to vote are probably already voting. It's only very fringe groups that don't vote regularly. So it comes down to if the economic interests of a very specific subgroup of voters can be persuaded. And there's really two demographics for this vote. And it's why, if you've paid attention to politics over the last 30 years, you'll notice this comes up quite a bit, surprisingly, for how small of a demographic these two groups are. Soccer moms and unionized workers. Unionized workers usually either vote Democrat in the US, or will vote Liberal Democrat in Canada, or they don't vote. Soccer moms usually vote Conservative, or they don't vote. Why is that? Well, again, union issues I've covered over quite clearly. But for the soccer mom, it's usually affordability, crime, security that the soccer mom wants. The soccer mom will vote Conservative because the Conservatives will give them those things. Only really the Conservatives can even pitch them those things. But they might not vote, because they're also very easily repulsed by nastiness, as seen by Trump. If we saw a Glenn Youngkin running for the U.S. president right now for the Republicans, the soccer mom would come out in droves. Now, there's other various things to consider. For other politics, it's not just that simple in the U.S., but that's what it really boils down to. Those are the two demographics that matter the most, because they're the most likely to either not vote or vote the predictable way. Sometimes the soccer mom will vote against conservatives if they think the conservative leader is nasty, such as Trump. They'll vote against Trump, for example. Or sometimes the unionized worker will vote for the conservative because they think the liberal candidate is out of touch or doesn't care or aloof, like Hillary Clinton. 2016 was a weird election. That's why. A lot of unionized workers voted Trump, and a lot of soccer moms voted Clinton. That's why that election was weird. Biden wins in 2020 because the soccer moms still vote for Biden, but Biden had better credentials, better reputation, and better trust with unionized workers. That's why we're seeing in the US right now Trump going to things like the UAW strike, and he went to East Palestine and all these things because he's trying to get the unionized voters to either vote for him or stay home. Does that make sense? I don't know, I'm asking you that. You can't reply. I guess comment below if you think that makes sense. But that's where we are looking. There's really no need to touch on the other areas. We should expect these deep urban areas to go left-wing if they merge. Right now, the Conservative Party in Canada, interestingly enough, actually does really well in urban areas. Despite what centrist types will always say that the Conservatives need to do better in urban areas in Canada, that's just completely wrong. So first off, we do terrible in Quebec. We do terrible in Montreal. So even despite doing awful in Montreal, one of the second largest urban area in the country, Conservatives in Canada outperform Republicans in the US in urban areas. The Republicans in the US will get 30 to 40% of the vote in urban areas, and Conservatives in Canada will get approximately 35 to 40% of the vote in urban areas. If you remove Quebec, it's about 40%, almost always. So we just do better in urban areas than the Conservatives in the US do, or in the UK do, or in Australia, or in New Zealand. Where the Conservatives in Canada are weak is, paradoxically, rural areas and suburbs. Suburbs aren't that paradoxical. The Conservatives in Canada do roughly 35 to 40% in the suburbs, about the same as the urbans. In the US, they will do about 45 to 55 in the suburbs. In rurals, the Republicans will get 60 to 70% in the rurals. In Canada, we're looking at 50%. Maybe you can push up to 55 with the PPC. If we delete Quebec's existence, this is closer to Republican numbers, but Quebec obviously exists in Canada, so we can't just ignore them for all these considerations. It's notable to ignore them for urban areas because we do as good as the GOP, the Conservatives do as good as the GOP in Canada, despite Quebec, where they do terrible. Doing about the same as the US parties, ignoring Quebec is not that interesting. Because, 78 ridings, about a quarter of the ridings in the country are actually relevant, surprisingly. But yes, this is the spectrum we should expect. This is the distribution we should expect. A conservative win, while seemingly unlikely based on this particular map, is actually more likely than right now with the setup. We should very easily expect the Conservatives to fall comfortably in the 38 to 45 range, about the same range as the Liberals in this scenario, and usually a tie means a Conservative win of some kind. The Bloc in this scenario is oppressive and will basically deny most majorities. But with that, I'll bid you all adieu, and I will see you probably quicker than you think. Probably going to do a midweek update for Manitoba as opposed to waiting until next Monday, but we will see. But with that, again, I bid you do. Comment below if you thought this video was interesting or stupid. I don't know.